Poland is leaving the so-called Istanbul Convention, which is a feminist treaty originally drafted by the Council of Europe. Turkey is contemplating the same things. The opponents of the exit claim that the treaty was just about violence, and on the surface, of course, this is a pretext. They are tone deaf to the underlying ideology. Supposedly, you have to implement everything feminists asks you to do in order to get rid of violence. And also they pretend that the complete eradication of all violence is somewhat possible. I'm reading it out to you. I've already read the first 3 chapters and the preamble, and now let's continue. Chapter 4, Protection and Support, Article 18, the general obligations thereof. Parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to protect all victims from any further acts of violence. Parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures in accordance with international law to ensure that there are appropriate mechanisms to provide for effective cooperation between all relevant state agencies, including the judiciary, public prosecutors, law enforcement agencies, local and regional authorities, as well as non-government organizations and other relevant organizations and entities in protecting and supporting victims and blah, blah, blah. So, it's not like this treaty has to establish the basic functions of government. So you wonder what the heck are they actually trying to do? And the NGO stuff that they try to knit this together seems like an effort to erase the boundaries between the powers of a state versus the private sector or the private life. And I think this is what feminism, or this modern incarnation of feminism, tries to do. They actually try to establish a totalitarianism where the state negotiates every single aspect of your life to the minutiae. Was also to flush the funds to these NGOs. Number 3, parties shall ensure that measures taken pursuant to this chapter shall -1 be based on a gendered understanding of violence against women. Again, I have no idea what gendered understanding could be. Against women and domestic violence, and shall focus on the human rights and safety of the victim. -2 be based on an integrated approach which takes into account the relationship between victims, perpetrators, children, and their wider social environment. -3 aim at avoiding secondary victimization. Gosh, they're talking as if every woman has a hatchet in her skull. 4 aim at the empowerment and economic independence of women victims of violence. Do women have to be better to get a job? -5 allow where appropriate for a range of protection and support services to be located on the same premises. -6 address the specific needs of vulnerable people, including child victims, to be made available to them. Number 4, the provisions of services shall not depend on the victim's willingness to press charges or testify against any perpetrator. And here again, I refrain from making any statements whether you can judge on your own whether some slap is hard or not. And I would also agree that if you see a woman with a hematome, that you also ask her to seek the authorities, because that, of course, hints to something like a severe case of battery, like punches and kicks and so forth. And of course, on that side too. And I will refrain from making the argument that maybe there are lighter things that can be misunderstood and stuff, and that you should be able to negotiate some of the stuff on your own. Number 5, parties shall take the appropriate measures to provide consular and other protection and support to their nationals and other victims entitled to such protection in accordance with their obligations under international law. I have actually no idea what international law is negotiating private battery, domestic violence stuff. But you're also talking combat in Europe. Article 19, information. Parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to ensure that victims receive adequate and timely information on available support service and legal measures in a language they understand. I think I just shake my head and move on. Article 20, General Support Service. General support services. Number 1, parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to ensure that victims have access to services facilitating their recovery from violence. These measures should include, when necessary, services such as legal, psychological counseling, financial assistance, housing, education, training, and assistance in finding employment. And again, here we are talking about incentives to actually report violence, which is misconstrued. It's botching the whole idea of getting justice. Number 2 is parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to ensure that victims have access to health care and social services, and that services are adequately resourced and professionals are trained to assist victims and refer them to the appropriate services. Article 21, assistance to individual collective complaints. Parties shall ensure that victims have information on and access to applicable regional and international individual collective complaints mechanism. Hell, everybody, the last refugee has a smartphone and everybody knows how to call the police. Article 22, specialist support services. Number 1, parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to provide or arrange for inadequate geographical distribution, immediate, short and long-term specialist support services to any victim subjected to any of the acts of violence covered by the scope of this convention, whatever the heck they even try to say. Number 2, parties shall provide or arrange for specialist women's support services to all women victims of violence and blah, blah, blah. I think all the specialist blah, blah, blah just means they want some sinecure offices, and they claim that all these gender... we have actually some professions in every bureaucracy in Germany called Frauenbeauftragte. God knows what these people are doing, but I assume they can claim that, when somebody calls with a hatch in her skull, she will call the police. So that's the assistance that the specialists are supposed to provide, I suppose. Shelters. Parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to provide for the setting of appropriate, easily accessible shelters in sufficient numbers to provide safe accommodation for and to reach out proactively to victims, especially women and their children. Article 24, telephone helpline. So finally, we are talking about the internet and the phone. Parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to set up statewide round-the-clock 24/7 telephone helplines free of charge to provide advice to callers confidentially or with due regard to their anonymity in relation to all forms of violence covered by the blah blah blah. So yes, now finally they can call the police. Article 25, support for victims of sexual violence. Parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to provide for the setting up of appropriate, easily accessible rape crisis and or sexual violence referral centers for victims in sufficient numbers to provide for medical forensic examination, trauma support and counseling for victims. I think in all Europe, when you call the police, they will send you directly to a specialized doctor who looks into the medical aspects of whether this looks like a true rape or not. This is a common procedure, I think, in all European countries, so this is totally useless. Article 26, protection and support for child witnesses. Number 1, parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to ensure that in the provision of protection and support services to victims, due account is taken of the rights and needs of child witnesses of all forms of violence covered by the scope of the convention. Measures taken pursuant to this article shall include age-appropriate psychosocial counseling for child witnesses of all forms of violence covered by the scope. Heck, as if nobody before those people had thought about helping children in witness situations. Article 27, reporting. Parties shall take the necessary measures to encourage any person witness to the commission of acts of violence covered by the scope of the convention or has reasonable grounds to believe that such an act may be committed or that further acts of violence are to be expected, to report this to competent organizations or authorities. We are talking government leaders signing this. Are they supposed to call the police? Article 28, reporting by professionals. Parties shall take the necessary measures to ensure that the confidentiality rules imposed by international law on certain professionals do not constitute an obstacle to the possibility, under appropriate conditions, of their reporting to the competent organizations, which is the police, or authorities, if they have reasonable grounds to believe that a serious act of violence covered by the scope of this convention has been committed, and further serious acts of violence are to be expected. I'm kind of saying the medicine must not be worse than the disease, and you really have to wonder if a doctor, for example, should call the police on his own or not.